The turbulence hit Flight 847 like a sledgehammer at 37,000 feet, sending coffee cups flying and prayers whispered in a dozen languages. But while passengers gripped their armrests and flight attendants braced against cabin walls, the woman in seat 12F remained perfectly still, her weathered hands folded calmly in her lap, eyes closed as if she were listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Margaret. Maggie Chun had been flying for 63 years of her 78-year life, and she knew the difference between dangerous turbulence and what the young pilots up front would dismissively call a little chop. This was something else entirely, the kind of atmospheric violence that separated experienced aviators from weekend warriors, the kind that made seasoned flight crews earn their paychecks. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez from the flight deck. The intercom crackled with barely controlled tension. We're experiencing some unexpected severe turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, please take your jump seats immediately. Sarah Martinez, a 26-year-old flight attendant with barely 2 years under her wings, stumbled past row 12, fighting to maintain her professional composure as the aircraft bucked like a wild horse. She'd never experienced anything this violent, and the fear was creeping up her throat like bile. But as she passed the elderly Asian woman in 12F, something made her pause. The woman's lips were moving almost imperceptibly, and Sarah caught fragments of what sounded like technical jargon numbers, headings, altitudes, spoken with the precision of someone who understood exactly what was happening above the clouds. More strange still, despite the chaos around them, other passengers seemed to be unconsciously looking toward this small, unassuming woman as if she were an anchor in the storm. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Sarah asked, steadying herself against the seat back as another violent jolt shook the cabin. Maggie opened her eyes deep, brown eyes that held decades of sky wisdom, and smiled with a calmness that seemed to radiate outward. "The captain's doing fine work up there. Tell him if he climbs to 41,000 and adjusts his heading 15 degrees northeast, he'll find smoother air in about 6 minutes. The storm system has a predictable pattern." Sarah stared at her, bewildered. "Ma'am, how could you possibly know that?" Before Maggie could answer, the aircraft dropped suddenly, as if the sky had opened beneath them. Screams erupted throughout the cabin. A businessman in 14D was gripping his seat so hard his knuckles had gone white. The young mother across the aisle was holding her infant close, tears streaming down her face as she whispered desperate prayers. Even the seemingly confident businessman in 10A had gone pale, his expensive suit unable to hide the fear that made his hands shake. But Maggie simply reached up and pressed the call button. Within 30 seconds, despite the turbulence, Sarah had returned, her own fear now mixed with curiosity about this passenger who seemed to possess an otherworldly calm. "Ma'am, you called. Could you please ask Captain Rodriguez to contact me through the intercom? Tell him." Maggie paused, her eyes distant, calculating something invisible. "Tell him that Sierra Hotel 79er requests a brief consultation." Sarah's training had never prepared her for a passenger making cryptic requests during emergency conditions, but something in the woman's voice, an authority that transcended age and circumstance, made her nod. "I single quotes LL. I'll relay that message." As Sarah fought her way forward to the cockpit, Maggie closed her eyes again and listened. Not to the screams of frightened passengers or the groaning of stressed aluminum, but to the subtle changes in engine tone, the way the aircraft's movements told a story of wind shear and pressure differentials. The intricate dance between machine and atmosphere that she'd been studying for more than 6 decades. In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez was fighting the worst turbulence of his 15-year career. His co-pilot, First Officer Williams, was running through emergency checklists with the methodical precision of someone trying not to panic. The weather radar showed a massive storm system that seemed to have materialized from nowhere, and their current altitude was putting them right in the teeth of it, Captain. Sarah's voice came through the intercom, barely audible over the noise of the struggling aircraft. I have a passenger in 12F who says to tell you that Sierra Hotel 79er requests a brief consultation. She also said if you climb to 41,000 and adjust heading 15 degrees northeast, you'll find smoother air in 6 minutes. Rodriguez and Williams exchanged glances. Sierra Hotel 79er, that was a military call sign format and an old one. The passenger was suggesting a specific course correction that would take them higher into potentially thinner air. A risky move during severe turbulence unless you knew exactly what you were doing. Did she say anything else? Rodriguez asked, his hands fighting the controls as another massive jolt threatened to tear the yoke from his grip. She seemed to know about the storm pattern, sir. She spoke like ... like she understood what was happening up here. Rodriguez had been flying long enough to know that sometimes help came from unexpected sources. Military aviators, retired airline pilots, even aerospace engineers sometimes found themselves in passenger seats, and their expertise could be invaluable in crisis situations. But the call sign bothered him. Sierra Hotel 79er sounded familiar, like something from aviation history. Williams, have you ever heard that call sign before? The younger pilot was scanning his instruments, but he shook his head. No, sir, but it sounds military. Maybe Air Force or Navy test pilot designation. Another violent shake rattled the aircraft. And Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. Put her through on the cabin intercom. 30 seconds later, Maggie's calm, authoritative voice filled the cabin and cockpit. Captain Rodriguez, this is Colonel Margaret Chun, United States Air Force, retired. Call sign Sierra Hotel 79er. I've been monitoring your situation from my seat, and I believe I can assist with navigation through this weather system. The effect was immediate and electric. In the cockpit, Rodriguez felt his heart skip. Every military pilot knew the legends, the call signs that had become part of aviation folklore. Sierra Hotel 79er wasn't just any designation. It was the call sign of the first woman to break the sound barrier in level flight. The test pilot who had pushed experimental aircraft beyond their limits in the 1960s and 70s. The officer who had helped develop modern flight safety protocols that had saved thousands of lives, but that was impossible. Sierra Hotel 79er had disappeared from public records decades ago, vanished into the classified world of black projects and top-secret test flights. Most pilots assumed the legendary aviator had died years ago in some unnamed test flight. That would never appear in official records. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with disbelief and hope, "can you authenticate that call sign?" Maggie's response came without hesitation. Authentication Charlie 77 Alpha Foxtrot. Test Pilot School, Class of 1967, Edwards Air Force Base. Logged first supersonic flight in the YF-12. Prototype on November 15, 1968. Served as primary test pilot for Project Silver Wing from 1969 to 1974. Classified clearance level remains active. The silence in the cockpit was profound. Rodriguez knew enough military aviation history to understand what he was hearing. The YF-12 program, Project Silver Wing, these were legendary classified programs that had pushed the boundaries of human flight. If this woman was who she claimed to be, she had more high-altitude, high-speed flight experience than any pilot currently flying commercial aircraft. "Colonel," Rodriguez said, his voice now filled with respect, "what do you recommend?" From seat 12F, Maggie looked out the small window at the storm clouds that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. She was reading the sky the way other people read books, seeing patterns and possibilities that came from a lifetime of dancing with the edge of the atmosphere. "Captain, you're currently at 37,000 feet, correct heading 240. The storm system you're encountering is part of a jet stream disruption caused by a high-pressure ridge moving east from the Rockies. The turbulence is most severe between 35 and 39,000 feet, but there's a smooth air pocket at 41,000. She paused, her mind calculating wind vectors and pressure differentials with the precision of a human flight computer. However, climbing through this turbulence will be challenging. You'll need to reduce your rate of climb to 300 feet per minute, adjust power settings to maintain optimal angle of attack, and most importantly, adjust your heading to 255 degrees to ride the edge of the pressure gradient rather than fighting directly through it." Rodriguez felt the aircraft buck violently again, but now he was listening with the attention of a student learning from a master. "Colonel, that heading will take us off our flight plan. How do you know there's smooth air at 41,000? Maggie smiled, though no one could see it. "Captain, I've flown through conditions that would make this look like a gentle breeze. Trust the math, trust the physics, and trust 60 years of reading the sky. The atmosphere has patterns, and once you learn them, they become as predictable as sunrise." In the cabin around her, passengers had stopped screaming. Something in the colonel's voice, the absolute certainty, the calm authority of someone who had faced death in the sky and lived to tell about it, was spreading through the aircraft like a calming wave. Even the crying infant had quieted, as if sensing that someone who truly understood their situation was now in control. "Colonel Chun," Rodriguez said, making his decision, "we're following your guidance." As the aircraft began its careful climb, fighting through layers of violent air toward the promised sanctuary at 41,000 feet, passengers throughout the cabin found themselves looking toward seat 12F with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Who was this small, elderly woman who spoke to pilots like an equal, who seemed to understand the mysteries of flight that terrified everyone else? Sarah, the flight attendant, had managed to return to her jump seat, but her eyes kept drifting. To Maggie, she'd been flying for 2 years and had never encountered anything like this. Passengers didn't give navigation advice to captains. Elderly women didn't possess encyclopedic knowledge of atmospheric conditions. And they certainly didn't carry military call signs that made experienced pilots speak to them with the reverence usually reserved for legends. But as the aircraft climbed steadily through the turbulence, exactly as Colonel Chun had predicted, the ride began to smooth. At 39,000 feet, the violent shaking decreased to a gentle rocking. At 40,000, even that disappeared. And at 41,000 feet, Flight 847 entered air so smooth it felt like they were floating. On Glass Dot, the collective sigh of relief from 237 passengers was audible throughout the cabin. But in seat 12F, Colonel Margaret Chun simply opened her eyes, looked out the window at the storm clouds now far below them, and began to close what appeared to be a well-worn leather flight logbook that she'd been holding in her lap throughout the entire ordeal. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez." The intercom now carried a tone of amazed gratitude. "As you can feel, we've successfully navigated through the storm system and are now in smooth air. Our arrival time into Denver will be approximately 15 minutes delayed, but we're back on course and should have clear skies for the remainder of our flight." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of respect that made everyone in the cabin listen more carefully. "I'd also like to acknowledge the assistance we received from one of our passengers, a distinguished military aviator whose expertise helped ensure your safety today. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, and we're grateful for the wisdom of experience." As whispers began to spread through the cabin, passengers craning their necks to see who the captain was referring to, Maggie quietly tucked her logbook into a simple canvas bag at her feet. Inside that bag, hidden from curious eyes, were items that would have told an incredible story to anyone who understood their significance. Wings from 6 different aircraft, commendation letters signed by presidents, photographs from test flights that officially never happened, and a Congressional Medal of Honor that had been awarded in a classified ceremony and never publicly announced. But to her fellow passengers, she remained simply the calm, elderly woman in seat 12F who had somehow known exactly what to do when the sky turned dangerous. The businessman in 14D, his color finally returning, leaned across the aisle. "Ma'am, excuse me, but did the captain just say you're a military pilot?" Maggie turned to him with the same gentle smile she'd shown the flight attendant. "I was many years ago. Sometimes old habits prove useful." "What did you fly?" asked the young mother, her infant now sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Various aircraft," Maggie replied diplomatically. "Experimental types, mostly. Testing new designs, pushing boundaries, seeing what was possible when you combined human skill with advancing technology." She didn't mention the supersonic flights that had shattered records and changed aviation forever. She didn't describe the classified missions that had helped win the Cold War through technological superiority. She certainly didn't talk about the crashes, the near-death experiences, the time she'd brought damaged aircraft home through pure skill and stubborn determination. To her fellow passengers, she was just a modest elderly woman who had somehow helped save their flight. But Sarah, the flight attendant, was beginning to understand that there was far more to this story than anyone realized. As the aircraft continued its smooth flight toward Denver, Sarah found herself drawn back to row 12. "Ma'am, could I ask you something?" "Of course, dear." "When you gave that call sign to the captain, Sierra Hotel 7-Nighter, he seemed to recognize it. Is that call sign famous somehow?" Maggie looked out the window at the vast expanse of sky that had been her home, her workplace, her passion for more than half a century. Below them, the storm system continued to rage, but up here in the thin air where she had spent the best years of her life, all was peaceful and clear. "Call signs are like names," she said finally. "They follow you through your career, become part of who you are. Some are forgotten when the pilot retires. Others ... while others become part of aviation history." She turned back to Sarah with eyes that seemed to hold decades of untold stories. "The sky remembers everyone who's flown through it, dear. Some of us just flew a little higher, a little faster, and a little longer than most." As Sarah walked away, her mind spinning with questions she didn't know how to ask, she had no idea that she had just met one of the most accomplished aviators in human history. A woman whose achievements had been classified for national security reasons, whose records had been sealed, whose very existence had been officially erased from public knowledge to protect the secrets she carried. But the sky knew, the sky remembered. Colonel Margaret Maggie Chen, Sierra Hotel 7-Nighter, the woman who had broken barriers, shattered records, and paved the way for every female pilot who came after her. The woman who had spent 60 years proving that the limit wasn't the sky, it was only the beginning. And now, as Flight 847 continued toward Denver in perfect flying conditions, passengers were beginning to understand that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the resolution of a dangerous weather situation, but a glimpse of living aviation history sitting quietly in seat 12F. Still watching over the sky she had helped conquer decades ago. The real story, however, was just beginning. The Marriott Hotel shuttle dropped Maggie off at the terminal entrance 3 hours before her next flight, exactly as she had calculated. At 78, she had learned that airports were best navigated with time and patience rather than speed and stress. She moved through the familiar choreography of modern air travel security lines. Gate changes, overpriced coffee with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this dance since commercial aviation was young. But what her fellow travelers couldn't see was the weight she carried in every step through the terminal. Not the physical weight of her single carry-on bag, which contained only the essentials needed for a week visiting her grandniece in Portland, but the invisible burden of a lifetime spent in the shadows of history. Margaret Chun had been erased from the official record so thoroughly that sometimes she wondered if she had dreamed her entire military career. The woman who had broken the sound barrier, who had test-piloted aircraft that wouldn't be declassified for another 50 years, who had helped develop flight systems that now kept millions of passengers safe every day, existed in no public database, no aviation hall of fame, no historical record that ordinary citizens could access. She settled into a vinyl chair at gate B-17 and watched the young pilots walking past in their crisp uniforms, their confident strides, their casual conversations about routes and weather, and crew schedules. They had no idea that the elderly Asian woman watching them had logged more high-altitude test flight hours than all of them combined, had survived crashes that should have killed her, had made discoveries about flight dynamics that were still classified as state secrets. "Excuse me, ma'am, is this seat taken?" A voice interrupted her reverie. She looked up to see a man in his 50s, wearing the uniform of a major airline, captain's stripes on his shoulders. He had the weathered look of someone who had spent decades in cockpits, the subtle confidence that came from handling emergencies and making split-second decisions, while responsible for hundreds of lives. "Please sit," Maggie said, moving her canvas bag to make room. The captain settled into the adjacent chair and immediately pulled out his phone, but something made him glance at her again. "Were you on flight 847 yesterday? From Phoenix to Denver?" Maggie nodded, wondering where this conversation would lead. "I heard about that from Captain Rodriguez. Pretty severe weather, from what I understand. He said a passenger helped with navigation advice." The captain's tone was carefully neutral, but Maggie could hear the curiosity beneath it. "Sometimes passengers have relevant experience," she replied diplomatically. The captain studied her face more carefully, the way pilots learn to read subtle indicators that might signal trouble. "Rodriguez mentioned a call sign. Sierra Hotel 79er. That's a famous designation in military aviation circles." Maggie felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever someone got too close to her past. For 40 years, she had lived with the knowledge that her greatest achievements could never be acknowledged, that her contributions to aviation safety and technology would remain forever classified. The weight of that silence had shaped every day of her retirement, every conversation with strangers, every moment when someone asked the innocent question that could lead to dangerous territory. "Military aviation has many call signs," she said carefully, "some more memorable than others." But the captain wasn't letting it go. "Ma'am, I don't mean to pry, but Sierra Hotel 79er, that call sign is legendary. Every military pilot learns about those early test flights. If you're who I think you are," he paused, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you're supposed to be dead." The words hit Maggie like a punch to the stomach. She had heard variations of this conversation before, always whispered, always uncertain. Always from pilots who half remembered stories they'd heard in flight school or read in classified briefings. But this was the first time someone had stated it so directly. "I'm very much alive," she said quietly, "but the person you're thinking of exists only in classified files that most people will never see." The captain leaned forward, his professional composure replaced by the excitement of a man who believed he was meeting a living legend. "Ma'am, if you are Colonel Chun, then you're the reason I'm alive today. The high-altitude recovery procedures. You developed the spin recovery techniques for swept-wing aircraft. That's part of our emergency training. You saved my life without ever knowing it, 20 years ago when I had an engine failure at 38,000 feet. Maggie felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. This was the cruel irony of her situation. Her work had saved thousands of lives, but she could never acknowledge it, never take credit. never experienced the satisfaction of knowing that her sacrifices had mattered. She was a ghost haunting the margins of aviation history, watching pilots benefit from her discoveries while being forbidden to claim them. "I'm glad you survived your emergency," she said finally. "Good pilots deserve to come home safely." The captain sensed her discomfort and sat back, but his eyes never left her face. Would you mind if I asked about Edwards Air Force Base? About the test flights in the 60s and 70s? This was the moment Maggie dreaded most when curiosity turned to specific questions about classified programs. She had spent 40 years perfecting the art of deflection, of giving answers that satisfied without revealing, of protecting national secrets while honoring the memory of colleagues who had died testing aircraft that officially never existed. "Edwards was a special place," she said carefully. "We tested many aircraft there. Some successful, some not. The goal was always to push the boundaries of what was possible, to make flying safer and more efficient for future generations. But the experimental programs, the supersonic flights... The captain was leaning forward again, his voice barely audible. "The records are sealed, but pilots talk. There are stories about flights that broke every rule, aircraft that could do things nobody believed possible." Maggie closed her eyes and let herself remember for just a moment. The feeling of breaking the sound barrier for the first time, the aircraft shuddering as it passed through the compression waves, then smoothing into the otherworldly quiet of supersonic flight. The experimental fighters that could climb at impossible angles, the reconnaissance aircraft that could fly higher than anything else in the sky, the bombers that could carry payloads across continents without refueling. She remembered the crashes too. Martinez, who died testing high angle of attack maneuvers in an experimental interceptor. Thompson, who didn't survive when his aircraft disintegrated during a high-speed run. Williams, who was lost when a prototype malfunctioned during a classified mission over the Pacific. All of them friends, all of them buried with honors, none of them officially acknowledged for the work that killed them. "Every pilot who tests experimental aircraft knows the risks," she said finally. "We accepted those risks because we believed the work was important. Some of us survived. Many did not. The aircraft we tested led to improvements in commercial aviation, military defense, and space exploration. Whether history remembers us or not is less important than whether the work mattered." The captain was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what she hadn't quite said directly. "Ma'am, if you are Colonel Chun, then on behalf of every pilot flying today, thank you. Your work. The classified work, the dangerous work, the work that nobody can officially acknowledge, it made all of us safer." Maggie felt something break open inside her chest, 40 years of carefully maintained barriers cracking under the simple weight of recognition. She had never heard those words before, never been thanked for the work that had defined her life, never had her sacrifices acknowledged by the aviation community that had benefited from them. "I was just doing my job," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't suppress. "No, ma'am. You were changing the world." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the busy terminal around them. Young pilots walked past, unaware. They were in the presence of someone who had helped make their careers possible. Passengers hurried to gates, trusting in flight safety systems that had been developed through the blood and courage of test. Pilots whose names they would never know. Finally, the captain spoke again. "Would you mind if I asked, why are you flying commercial? Don't military legends get special transportation privileges?" Maggie smiled sadly. "Legends don't exist in official records. As far as the government is concerned." Colonel Margaret Chun retired quietly in 1974 after an unremarkable career flying transport aircraft. The woman who broke sound barriers and tested experimental fighters is classified at levels that most people with security clearances will never see. That must be ... double quotes, the captain searched for words. That must be incredibly difficult. To have accomplished so much and never be able to talk about it. It was the price of the work, Maggie said simply. We knew that going in. National security. Required secrecy. Some of the aircraft we tested, some of the capabilities we developed, some of the missions we flew, they had to remain classified to protect American interests during the Cold War. Most of them still do. She paused, watching. A young female pilot walked past, confident and professional in her uniform. But seeing women flying today, seeing them accepted as equals in the cockpit, seeing them as airline captains and military commanders, that makes the silence bearable. We didn't break barriers so people would remember our names. We broke them, so the next generation wouldn't have to. The captain followed her gaze to the female pilot. Was it hard, being one of the first women in experimental test flights? Maggie laughed, a sound that carried decades of fought battles and hard-won respect. Hard doesn't begin to describe it. The men I worked with were professional, mostly, but the institution itself was unwelcoming to female aviators. I had to be twice as good to get half the recognition. Had to prove myself in every flight, every mission, every emergency. She remembered the early days at Edwards, when her presence in the ready room would bring conversations to an abrupt halt. The subtle and not-so-subtle attempts to discourage her from applying for the most dangerous test flights. The assumption that she was there as a publicity stunt rather than a qualified pilot. The extra scrutiny every time she made a mistake, the dismissal when she succeeded. But the aircraft didn't care about my gender, she continued. Physics didn't discriminate. When you're pulling 8 Gs in a high-performance fighter, or trying to recover from an uncontrolled spin at 40,000 feet, your survival depends entirely on skill, knowledge, and the ability to make split-second decisions. Under pressure. The sky is the ultimate equalizer. Is that why you continued? Despite the obstacles? Maggie considered the question seriously. It was something she had asked herself thousands of times over the decades, why she had persisted when quitting would have been easier, safer, more socially acceptable. I continued because I was good at it, she said finally. And because every barrier I broke made it easier for the women who came after me. Every successful flight, every survived emergency, every experimental aircraft I brought home safely, was proof that women belonged in the cockpit. Not as curiosities or tokens, but as equal contributors to the science and art of flight. The captain shook his head in amazement. The pilots flying today, especially the women, they have no idea what they owe you. That's how progress works, Maggie replied. Each generation builds on the sacrifices of the previous one, often without knowing it. The women flying commercial airlines today, the female test pilots, the astronauts, they're living in a world where their gender is no longer considered a disqualification for flying. That's worth more than any recognition I might have received. A gate announcement interrupted their conversation. Now boarding Flight 482 to Portland, rows 1 through 15. Maggie's flight dot as she gathered her belongings. The captain stood and extended his hand. Ma'am, it's been an honor, I hope someday your story can be told properly. Maggie shook his hand, feeling the calluses that came from decades of handling aircraft controls. Perhaps someday. When the classified programs are declassified. When national security no longer requires secrecy. When the full story of Cold War aviation can be told without compromising ongoing operations. She paused, then added quietly, but until then, the work speaks for itself. Every safe landing, every successful emergency recovery, every pilot who comes home alive, that's the real legacy. Not recognition, but results. As she walked toward the boarding gate, Maggie reflected on the conversation. It had been both painful and healing to have someone recognize her contributions, even indirectly. For 40 years, she had carried the weight of silence, the frustration of watching others receive credit for innovations she had helped develop, the loneliness of possessing knowledge and experiences that could never be shared. But conversations like this one reminded her why she had accepted those constraints. The work had been more important than personal recognition. The advancement of aviation technology, the improvement of flight safety, the opening of opportunities for future generations of pilots, these achievements were worth a lifetime of anonymity. Still, as she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, she couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to walk into an aviation museum and see her photograph on the wall, to read her name in a history book, to have young pilots learn about her contributions in flight school, to exist in the official record as more than a footnote, to be remembered as the woman who helped push human flight beyond the speed of sound and into the realm of the possible. But that was a fantasy for another lifetime. In this one, she was simply Margaret Chen, passenger in seat 12F, carrying secrets that would die with her and a legacy that would live forever in the safer skies she had helped create. The flight to Portland was mercifully uneventful smooth. Air, professional crew, and passengers who saw her as nothing more than another elderly traveler. But as Maggie deplaned at PDX, she noticed something that made her pause at the jet bridge. Two men in dark suits were scanning the deplaning passengers with the practiced eyes of federal agents, their gaze lingering on each face as if searching for someone specific. When their eyes met hers, one of them stepped forward. "Ma'am, could we have a word with you?" 40 years of classified existence had taught Maggie to recognize government operatives instantly. These men had the bearing, the subtle earpieces, the coordinated movements of a security detail. Her blood ran cold as she realized that her conversation with Captain Rodriguez, and perhaps yesterday's airport encounter, had somehow triggered official attention. "Of course," she said calmly, though her mind was already calculating exit strategies and wondering if her decades-old security clearances were about to become a problem. They escorted her to a small office near the gate, the kind of anonymous, administrative space that existed in every major airport for situations that required privacy. The lead agent, a man in his 40s with prematurely gray hair, introduced himself as Agent Harrison from the Department of Defense Security Service. "Ma'am, we understand you assisted with a flight emergency yesterday using specialized knowledge. That suggests military aviation background." Maggie kept her expression neutral. "I offered some general guidance based on flying experience, nothing more." "Ms. Chen, we're going to need you to be more specific." Harrison placed a tablet on the small table between them, and Maggie's heart sank as she saw what was displayed. Her official service record, classified at levels that most government employees would never see. Photographs from Edwards Air Force Base, flight test reports, commendation letters from missions that officially never happened. According to these records, Harrison continued, Colonel Margaret Chen died in a classified flight test accident in 1974. Yet here you are, very much alive, using knowledge from classified programs to assist civilian aircraft in distress. Maggie realized she was facing her worst nightmare. The careful fiction that had protected her for 40 years was unraveling because she had been unable to resist, helping fellow aviators in danger. The woman who had spent decades invisible to history was suddenly visible to people who had the power to make her disappear permanently. "I think there's been some confusion," she said carefully. "My service record should show routine transport flights, nothing classified above standard levels." Agent Harrison's partner, a younger man who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Ma'am, we have audio recordings from yesterday's flight." Captain Rodriguez filed a full report, including your authentication codes from programs that are still classified at the highest levels. That information could only come from someone with direct access to operations that officially never existed. The trap was closing around her. Maggie realized that her instinct to help had created a security breach that threatened not just her own carefully maintained anonymity, but potentially the classification status of programs that were still sensitive to national security. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. Harrison leaned forward. "We want to understand how a dead woman is walking around with knowledge from classified programs. And more importantly, we want to ensure that national security information isn't being compromised by unauthorized personnel." "I am not unauthorized personnel," Maggie said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had held the highest security clearances in the military. "My clearances were suspended when I officially retired, not revoked. My access to classified information was terminated, but my knowledge of that information was not erased. Ma'am, according to our records, Colonel Margaret Chun never retired. She died in a test flight accident and was buried with full military honors in a classified ceremony. The woman sitting in front of me is either an imposter with impossible knowledge or—" Harrison trailed off, studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that shouldn't exist. "Or what?" Maggie prompted. "Or the official records are a cover story, and we're dealing with someone whose actual history is classified at levels beyond our clearance to investigate." The room fell silent as the implications settled over all three of them. Maggie realized that these agents had stumbled onto something they weren't equipped to handle, a classified program, so deep that even security personnel didn't have access to the real story. "I suggest you contact your superiors," she said finally. "There are people in the Pentagon who can verify my status and explain the discrepancies in your records. But be aware that making those inquiries will require clearances that may not be readily available." Harrison exchanged glances with his partner, clearly out of their depth. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to remain available while we sort this out." "Am I under arrest?" "You're a person of interest in a potential security breach. We'd prefer your cooperation, but we have authority to detain you if necessary." Maggie felt the walls closing in around her. The peaceful retirement she had carefully constructed was crashing down because she couldn't bear to let fellow aviators suffer when she had knowledge that could help them. She was being punished for doing what any pilot would do, using her expertise to ensure safe flight. "I have a grandniece expecting me," she said. "She worry if I don't arrive as scheduled. You can call her from here. We'll provide accommodation while this is being resolved." As Harrison reached for his phone to make arrangements, Maggie made a decision that would change everything. "Agent Harrison, before you make any calls, I suggest you contact General Patricia Morrison at the Pentagon. Tell her that Sierra Hotel 79er is requesting consultation on a classification review matter." Harrison paused, his finger hovering over his phone. "General Morrison doesn't handle routine security matters." "This isn't routine," Maggie said firmly. "General Morrison was my student at Edwards Air Force Base in 1972. She learned advanced flight test procedures from me when she was a lieutenant, fresh out of pilot training. If anyone can verify my identity and resolve this situation without compromising ongoing classified programs, it's her." Harrison stared at her, the implications of what she'd just revealed hitting him like a freight train. If this elderly woman had been training officers who were now generals, if she had been at Edwards in 1972 teaching advanced procedures, then she wasn't just a former test pilot, she was someone whose career had shaped the current leadership of military aviation. "Ma'am, General Morrison is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. She's responsible for global air operations for the entire Air Force." "I'm aware of her current position," Maggie replied. "I'm also aware that she still uses modified flight procedures I developed for high-altitude reconnaissance missions. Procedures that remain classified and are only known to pilots who learned them directly from me or from those I trained." The younger agent finally spoke up. "Ma'am, you're suggesting that you trained officers who are now running the Air Force?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating a fact that can be verified by calling General Morrison and asking her about her time at Edwards, specifically about the instructor who taught her how to recover from inverted spins in swept-wing aircraft at altitudes above 50,000 feet. Harrison made the call. 20 minutes later, after being transferred through multiple levels of Pentagon security, he found himself speaking directly to General Morrison's aide. When he explained the situation, there was a long pause before the aide asked him to hold. Another 10 minutes passed before General Morrison herself came on the line. From where she sat, Maggie could hear both sides of the conversation through Harrison's phone. "Agent Harrison, you said you have someone in custody who claims to have trained me at Edwards." "Yes, ma'am. An elderly Asian woman who goes by Margaret Chun. She used knowledge from classified programs to assist a civilian aircraft yesterday, and she's given authentication codes that we can't verify through normal channels." "What codes?" Harrison read from his tablet. "Sierra Hotel 79er with authentication Charlie 77 Alpha Foxtrot." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Harrison checked to see if the call had been dropped. Finally, General Morrison's voice came through, tight with emotion. "Agent Harrison, you will release that woman immediately. You will escort her personally to wherever she needs to go. You will ensure that no record of this detention appears in any database, and you will forget that this conversation ever happened." "Ma'am, I don't understand, Agent Harrison. The woman you have in custody is Colonel Margaret Chen, one of the most decorated test pilots in Air Force history. Her records are classified at levels that require presidential authorization to access. The fact that she's alive contradicts official records because her survival was itself classified for national security reasons." Harrison looked at Maggie with new understanding. "Ma'am, what exactly are we dealing with here?" "You're dealing with a woman who helped win the Cold War by testing aircraft and flying missions that were so sensitive they couldn't be acknowledged, even within classified military channels. A woman whose survival of certain crashes had to be covered up because admitting she lived would have revealed capabilities that enemies couldn't know we possessed." General Morrison's voice softened. "Agent Harrison, Colonel Chun taught me how to fly aircraft that officially don't exist. She showed me techniques for handling emergencies that saved my life at least 3 times during my career. Every pilot in the Air Force is flying safer today because of innovations she developed through classified test programs. But the records show she died in 1974. The records show what they need to show. Colonel Chun's death was a necessary fiction to protect operational security during some of the most sensitive programs in military history. Her actual status is known only to a handful of people with clearances that require personal approval from the Secretary of Defense." Harrison felt like he was drowning in a situation far beyond his pay grade. "General, what should we do?" "You should apologize to Colonel Chun for the misunderstanding, ensure she gets to her destination safely, and file a report stating that the security matter was resolved through appropriate channels. Nothing more." After Harrison hung up, the small office was silent for a long moment. Finally, the younger agent spoke. "Ma'am, I don't think we understand what we've stumbled into here." Maggie looked at both men with compassion. They were dedicated professionals doing their jobs, trying to protect national security, but they had accidentally uncovered one of the military's most carefully guarded secrets. "Gentlemen, you've stumbled into the reality that some people who serve their country have to disappear from history in order to protect the nature of their service. The work I did was so sensitive that acknowledging it, even decades later, could compromise ongoing operations." Harrison ran his hands through his hair. "Ma'am, how many people like you are there? People who officially don't exist, but are walking around with classified knowledge." "Fewer than you might think, more than you'd hope," Maggie replied. "The Cold War required sacrifices that went beyond risking life in combat. Some of us sacrificed our place in history, our recognition, our ability to share our experiences with family and friends. We became ghosts in the machine of national defense. She stood up, gathering her small bag. But the work we did mattered. The aircraft flying today, the safety systems protecting passengers, the capabilities that keep America secure, they exist because people were willing to test the impossible and remain silent about their achievements. As they prepared to leave the office, Harrison had one more question. "Ma'am, why did you help that flight yesterday? You had to know it might expose your situation." Maggie paused at the door. "Agent Harrison, when you've spent your life learning how to keep people safe in the sky, you can't just sit in seat 12F and watch them struggle with problems you know how to solve. The classification of my past doesn't override my responsibility to help fellow aviators when they're in danger, even if it costs you your anonymity, especially then. The whole point of serving in classified programs was to protect people. If I can still do that, even as a civilian passenger, then the service continues." As they walked through the terminal, Harrison noticed something remarkable happening. Word had somehow spread among the airport staff about who Maggie was, or at least that she was someone special. Pilots walking past would nod respectfully, some stopping to introduce themselves and thank her for something they couldn't quite articulate. Gate agents smiled warmly, TSS officers waved, and ground crew members paused in their work to watch her pass. "Ma'am, how do they know?" the younger agent asked. "Aviation is a smaller community than people realize," Maggie explained. "Pilots talk to each other. Stories spread. Yesterday's incident has been discussed in crew lounges and flight operations centers across the country. They may not know the details of my history, but they understand that someone helped their colleagues in distress." As they reached the terminal exit where Maggie's grandniece was waiting, Harrison made one final attempt to understand the situation he'd encountered. "Colonel Chen, the programs you were involved in, are they still running?" Maggie smiled sadly. "Agent Harrison, I've been retired for 40 years. The specific programs I worked on ended with the Cold War, but the principles we established, the safety protocols we developed, the boundaries we pushed, those continue in new forms with new technologies and new challenges." She looked out at the aircraft moving on the tarmac, each one a testament to decades of aviation, progress built on the sacrifices of test pilots whose names would never be known. Every generation of aviators built on the work of those who came before them. The risks we took, the barriers we broke, the knowledge we gained through dangerous experimentation, it all contributed to making flight safer, faster, and more efficient for everyone who followed. Harrison extended his hand. "Ma'am, on behalf of everyone whose life has been made safer by your service, thank you." "Thank you for understanding," Maggie replied, "and for letting me get back to being a grandmother visiting family instead of a security risk to be managed." As she walked toward her grandniece, Maggie reflected on how close she had come to losing the quiet life she had spent 40 years building. The incident had revealed how precarious her anonymity really was, how easily a moment of professional instinct could unravel decades of careful secrecy. But it had also shown her something else, that her work had mattered, that people throughout the aviation community carried the benefits of her service even without knowing her name, and that the sacrifices she had made for national security had genuinely contributed to a safer world. The conversation with General Morrison, overheard through Harrison's phone, had been particularly meaningful. To learn that her former student now held one of the highest positions in the Air Force, that techniques Maggie had developed were still being used to save lives, that her legacy lived on in the careers of pilots she had trained, these revelations provided a kind of recognition that official awards could never match. Still, as she embraced her grandniece and prepared to resume her life as a private citizen, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with federal agents was just the beginning of something larger. The careful balance she had maintained between secrecy and service was shifting, and she wasn't sure where it would settle. The aviation community was talking about Sierra Hotel 7 Nighter again. Government security services were asking questions about classified programs. And somewhere in the Pentagon, people with the highest clearances were reviewing files that hadn't been opened in decades. Change was coming, whether she wanted it or not. The question was whether that change would threaten the life she had built or finally allow her to step out of the shadows and claim her place in aviation history. But those were concerns for another day. Today, she was simply Aunt Maggie, visiting family in Portland, carrying secrets that had shaped the world and a hope that her service had made the skies safer for everyone who dared to fly. The call came at 6:47 a.m. Pacific Time, jolting Maggie from the first deep sleep she'd had in her grandniece's guest bedroom. Lisa, her brother's granddaughter, knocked softly on the door. "Aunt Maggie, there's someone from the Air Force on the phone. Says it's urgent." Maggie's blood chilled. After yesterday's encounter with federal agents, she had hoped to disappear back into anonymity. But as she took the phone, she recognized the voice immediately. General Patricia Morrison, the lieutenant she had trained at Edwards Air Force Base 5 decades ago. "Colonel Chun, I hope you'll forgive the early call and the intrusion on your family time." "Patricia?" Maggie hadn't spoken to her former student in over 20 years. "What's happened?" "Ma'am, your situation yesterday in Portland has created complications. The inquiry about your status has triggered reviews at levels I can't discuss over an unsecured line. I'm calling to ask if you would consider returning to Washington for a classified briefing. Voluntarily, of course, but the matter is time-sensitive." Maggie felt the familiar weight of government bureaucracy settling around her like a shroud. "Patricia, I'm 78 years old. I've been retired for 40 years. What could possibly require my involvement now?" "Colonel, I can't say more over this line, but the programs you worked on have become relevant again. New situations, new technologies, new threats that require the kind of expertise you developed during your classified service." The careful phrasing told Maggie everything she needed to know. Morrison was speaking in the coded language of classified communications, suggesting that current national security matters somehow connected to the experimental programs Maggie had worked on decades ago. "How soon?" she asked. "Today, if possible. I've arranged transportation. A military aircraft is standing by at Portland International to bring you to Andrews Air Force Base." Maggie looked out the guest bedroom window at her grandniece's suburban neighborhood. Neat lawns, quiet streets, the peaceful normalcy she had spent 4 decades creating and protecting. She was being pulled back into a world she thought she had left forever. "Patricia, am I being recalled to active duty?" "Ma'am, your status is ... complex. Let's just say that some classifications never truly expire, and current circumstances have made your expertise relevant to ongoing operations." 2 hours later, Maggie found herself in the passenger compartment of a military transport aircraft, flying east toward a meeting she couldn't have imagined when she woke up that morning. The crew treated her with the respectful formality reserved for senior officers. Despite her civilian clothes and advanced age, the flight gave her time to think about the programs Morrison might be referencing. Project Silver Wing had involved testing aircraft with capabilities that pushed the boundaries of physics: hypersonic speeds, extreme altitudes, flight characteristics that remained classified decades later. The reconnaissance missions she had flown had gathered intelligence using technologies that enemies still couldn't detect or understand. But those programs had ended with the Cold War. The aircraft had been retired. The technologies transferred to other projects, the operational requirements superseded by satellite surveillance and electronic intelligence gathering. What could possibly make her 40-year-old expertise relevant to current threats? The answer began to emerge when she was escorted into a classified briefing room deep within the Pentagon. The people assembled around the conference table represented the highest levels of military and intelligence leadership: generals, admirals, agency directors, and civilians with security clearances that required presidential approval. General Morrison stood as Maggie entered. "Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Margaret Chun, call sign Sierra Hotel 79er, formerly the senior test pilot for Project Silver Wing and related classified programs." The reaction around the table was immediate and profound. Several people stood. Others leaned forward with expressions of recognition and amazement. Maggie realized that she was looking at aviation and defense, professionals who had built their careers on technologies and procedures she had helped develop. Admiral James Patterson, Director of Naval Intelligence, was the first to speak. "Colonel Chun, I flew F-14 Tomcats using modified flight control systems based on your high angle of attack research. Your work saved my life during a carrier landing in the Persian Gulf." General Robert Hayes, Air Force Chief of Staff, nodded gravely. "Ma'am, the high-altitude reconnaissance protocols you developed are still being used in current operations. Classified operations that I can't detail here, but operations that are crucial to national security." Dr. Sarah Williams, apparently a civilian contractor, added, "Colonel, the mathematical models you created for hypersonic flight dynamics are the foundation for our current aerospace defense systems. Without your experimental data, we couldn't have developed countermeasures for certain foreign weapons systems." Maggie felt overwhelmed by this sudden recognition from people whose careers had been built on her classified work. For 40 years, she had wondered if her service had mattered, if the risks she had taken and the anonymity she had accepted had contributed to anything meaningful. Now she was learning that her innovations were still protecting American interests. Decades later, General Morrison gestured to a seat at the conference table. "Colonel, please sit. We have a situation that requires your unique expertise." As Maggie took her place among the most senior leadership of American defense and intelligence agencies, Morrison activated a large display screen showing satellite imagery of what appeared to be a remote desert facility. 6 months ago, intelligence assets detected unusual flight activities at this location in a foreign nation I can't name in this briefing. The aircraft being tested appear to use flight characteristics that match classified American programs from the 1970s. The implications hit Maggie immediately. Someone had reverse-engineered technologies from her era, possibly using stolen intelligence or defected personnel who had worked on the original programs. Dr. Williams continued the briefing. "The aircraft we've observed demonstrate capabilities that should be impossible based on current foreign aviation technology. Extreme high-altitude performance, hypersonic speeds, flight maneuvers that suggest advanced control systems far beyond what our intelligence assessments indicate this nation should possess." Admiral Patterson leaned forward. "Colonel Chun, the flight characteristics we're seeing match the theoretical performance parameters of aircraft you tested in Project Silver Wing. We need to understand what they might have access to, what capabilities they might have developed, and how we should respond." Maggie studied the satellite images, her mind automatically analyzing the flight patterns and facility layout. Even after 40 years, she could read the subtle indicators that revealed aircraft performance characteristics. "How many people knew about the specific programs you're referencing?" she asked. General Hayes consulted a classified document. "According to our records, fewer than 50 people had access to the complete technical specifications. Most of those individuals are deceased, and the survivors have been accounted for except for 3 who disappeared during the final phase of the program in 1974. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. 3 missing personnel from the most classified aviation programs in American history, now matched with foreign aircraft demonstrating impossible capabilities. "Who were they?" Maggie asked, though she suspected she already knew. Morrison's voice was grim. "Dr. Michael Petrov, a propulsion specialist who disappeared from Edwards in January 1974. Captain David Liu, a flight test engineer who vanished 3 months later. And Major Sarah Volkov, a pilot who was reported killed in a training accident, but whose body was never found. Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. She had worked directly with all three of them, had trusted them with her life during dangerous test flights, had considered them friends and colleagues. The possibility that they had betrayed the programs, stolen the technologies, and sold American aviation secrets to foreign powers was a betrayal that cut deeper than any personal wound. "You think they defected," she said quietly. "We think they were recruited, possibly years before their disappearances," Admiral Patterson replied. "Deep cover agents who spent years gaining access to the most sensitive programs, then disappeared. With comprehensive knowledge of American experimental aviation capabilities." Dr. Williams added, "The aircraft we're seeing now suggest they not only took technical specifications, but also had access to practical flying knowledge, the kind of expertise that could only come from someone who had actually tested these systems." General Morrison placed a hand on Maggie's shoulder. "Colonel, we need you to help us understand what they might have taken, what capabilities they might have transferred, and how we can counter the threat they've created." Maggie stared at the satellite images, seeing evidence of her life's work being used against the country she had served. The experimental aircraft she had risked her life to test, the flight procedures she had developed through dangerous trial and error, the technologies that were supposed to protect American interests, all potentially compromised by people she had trusted. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "We need you to review classified files from the programs, help us assess what capabilities might have been transferred, and consult on countermeasures," General Hayes explained. "Your knowledge of these systems is unique. Even the people who designed them didn't understand their operational limits the way you did." Admiral Patterson leaned forward. "Colonel, we also need you to consider the possibility of reactivation for a classified mission. If these aircraft are being used against American interests, we may need someone who understands their capabilities well enough to counter them." The room seemed to hold its breath as Maggie processed what was being asked of her. They weren't just seeking her consultation. They were asking a 78-year-old retired test pilot to return to active duty for a mission that would require her to confront the betrayal of her former colleagues and potentially risk her life once again for national security. She thought about the peaceful retirement she had built, the quiet life as a grandmother visiting family, the anonymity that had protected her for 4 decades. All of that would disappear if she accepted this assignment. She would be pulled back into the classified world of military operations, exposed to dangers she thought she had left behind, forced to relive the most classified and dangerous period of her career. But she also thought about the pilots flying today, the passengers trusting in aviation safety systems she had helped develop, the national security that depended on protecting American technological advantages from foreign exploitation. "General Morrison," she said finally, "I need to know one thing before I give you my answer." "Yes, ma'am?" "The aircraft I tested, the technologies I helped develop, are they still being used to protect American lives?" "Every day, Colonel. Every single day." Maggie nodded slowly, feeling the weight of duty settling around her like a familiar uniform she had thought she would never wear again. "Then I accept the assignment, but I have conditions." 3 months after accepting her recall to classified service, Colonel Margaret Chun stood in a hangar at Edwards Air Force Base, looking at an aircraft that seemed to have emerged from her memories. The XF-200 prototype was a direct descendant of the experimental fighters she had tested 50 years earlier, incorporating technologies that had remained classified for decades but were now essential for countering the foreign threat revealed by satellite intelligence. The intervening weeks had been a whirlwind of classified briefings, medical evaluations, and intensive training to update her knowledge of current aviation systems. Despite her age, Maggie had passed every test the Air Force could devise, proving that her expertise and reflexes remained sharp enough for the mission ahead. Dr. Sarah Williams, the civilian contractor who had briefed her at the Pentagon, approached with a tablet full of technical specifications. "Colonel, we've completed the modifications you recommended. The flight control system now incorporates the high-altitude recovery procedures you developed in 1972, updated for modern fly-by-wire technology." Maggie studied the specifications with the focused intensity that had made her legendary among test pilots. The XF-200 was designed to outperform the foreign aircraft that had been built using stolen American technology, but success would depend on pilot expertise that couldn't be programmed into any computer system. "The manual override capability?" she asked. "Exactly as you specified. In extreme flight regimes, the pilot can bypass automated systems and rely on direct control inputs. We've also installed the modified instrumentation you requested analog. Backups for situations where electronic systems might fail under stress." General Morrison joined them at the aircraft, her expression mixing pride and concern. "Colonel, you don't have to do this. We've identified other pilots who could be trained for the mission." Maggie looked up at the sleek experimental fighter. Its lines both familiar and alien, a fusion of 1970s innovation and 21st century technology. "Patricia, how long would it take to train another pilot to understand the flight characteristics of this aircraft at the performance levels required for the mission?" "Conservative estimate? 18 months, possibly 2 years. "We don't have that time," Maggie said simply. "Intelligence indicates the foreign aircraft will be operational within 6 months. If we're going to counter them, it has to be with someone who already understands how these systems behave at the edge of their performance envelope." The mission itself was elegant in its simplicity, but terrifying in its complexity. The foreign nation had been using their stolen aircraft for intelligence-gathering missions over Allied territory, flights that occurred at altitudes and speeds that made conventional interception impossible. The XF-200 was designed to reach those extreme flight regimes and demonstrate that American aviation technology remains superior to stolen and reverse-engineered copies. But the real mission went deeper than simple demonstration. Intelligence suggested that the 3 defectors from the 1970s programs were not only advising on aircraft performance but actively piloting the foreign aircraft. If true, Maggie might find herself in aerial combat against people she had once trained using aircraft technology she had helped develop, in a confrontation that would determine whether American aviation secrets remained protected or became tools for foreign aggression. The psychological preparation for this possibility had been almost as challenging as the technical training. Dr. Michael Petrov, Captain David Liu, and Major Sarah Volkov had been more than colleagues. They had been part of the tight-knit community of test pilots who shared the unique dangers and discoveries of experimental flight. Learning that they had betrayed not just their country, but their fellow aviators felt like a personal violation that cut deeper than any professional concern. "Colonel," Dr. Williams said, interrupting her thoughts, "we've received updated intelligence on the foreign aircraft capabilities. Would you like to review the latest assessments?" Maggie nodded, and Williams activated a secure display showing performance data that made her heart race with a mixture of excitement and dread. The foreign aircraft were demonstrating capabilities that matched or exceeded the theoretical limits of the program she had worked on 50 years earlier. "They're pushing the aircraft harder than we ever did," she observed. "These performance numbers suggest flight regimes that we considered too dangerous for human pilots." General Morrison frowned. "Could that be because they have better safety systems, or because they're willing to accept casualty rates that we wouldn't tolerate?" Maggie finished. "Patricia, if Petrov, Liu, and Volkov are involved in this program, they know exactly how dangerous these flight regimes are. They participated in the test flights where we lost aircraft and pilots pushing these same boundaries." The implications were sobering. The foreign program might be achieving superior performance by accepting risks that American programs had considered unacceptable. If true, it meant the upcoming mission would be even more dangerous than originally planned. Admiral Patterson arrived at the hangar with news that changed everything. "Colonel Chun, we've confirmed the identity of the primary pilot for the foreign aircraft. Electronic intelligence intercepted communications using a call sign we recognize." Maggie felt her blood turn to ice. "Which call sign?" "Red Fox 37, Major Sarah Volkov." The hangar fell silent. Sarah Volkov had been one of the most skilled pilots in the experimental programs, someone Maggie had personally trained in advanced flight techniques. She had also been someone Maggie had considered a protege and friend, a younger pilot who shared her passion for pushing the boundaries of human flight. "Are we certain?" Maggie asked. "Voice analysis confirms identity with 94% confidence. We also intercepted technical discussions that reference flight procedures you developed specifically for high-altitude intercept missions." General Morrison looked grim. "Colonel, this changes the nature of the mission. You're not just facing foreign pilots using stolen technology. You're potentially going up against someone you trained personally." Maggie walked to the aircraft and placed her hand on its smooth surface, feeling the cool metal that represented decades of aviation progress, built on her work and the work of colleagues like Volkov. The betrayal was complete, now not just the theft of technology, but the perversion of pilot training relationships that were supposed to be sacred in the aviation community. "General, I need to ask you something directly," she said. "Is this mission about demonstrating American aviation superiority? Or is it about stopping Sarah Volkov specifically?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Admiral Patterson finally answered, "Colonel, it's about both. We need to show that stolen American technology cannot be used against American interests with impunity. But we also need to send a message that betraying classified programs has consequences, even decades later." Maggie understood. This wasn't just a test flight or a demonstration mission. It was a reckoning. The quiet retirement she had built was ending, not just because her country needed her expertise, but because unfinished business from her classified career was threatening current operations. "When do we fly?" she asked. "The mission window opens in 72 hours, General Morrison replied. "Weather and intelligence factors will determine the exact timing, but you need to be ready for immediate deployment." The next 3 days passed. In a blur of final preparations, classified briefings, and equipment checks, Maggie found herself falling back into routines she hadn't followed in 40 years, the methodical preparation rituals that test pilots, used to manage fear and maximize performance in life-threatening situations. On the evening before the mission, she sat alone in her temporary quarters at Edwards, reviewing flight manuals and performance specifications by the light of a desk lamp. The work was familiar but strange, like speaking a language she hadn't used in decades, but still understood perfectly. A knock at the door interrupted her studies. General Morrison entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone struggling with difficult decisions. "Colonel, I wanted to speak with you privately before tomorrow's mission." Maggie accepted the coffee gratefully. "Patricia, you're concerned about my age." "I'm concerned about asking someone I respect to risk her life for a mission that should have been resolved 40 years ago." Morrison sat down across from her. "Ma'am, you trained me when I was a lieutenant who thought I knew everything about flying. You taught me that the sky doesn't care about your confidence. It only respects your competence. That's still true. But you also taught me that a good pilot knows when to decline a mission that's beyond their capabilities." Morrison leaned forward. "Colonel, I have to ask, are you flying this mission because you're the best person for the job, or because you feel responsible for what Volkov and the others did?" The question cut to the heart of Maggie's motivations, forcing her to examine feelings she had been avoiding. Was she accepting this mission out of professional duty or personal guilt? Did she feel responsible for the betrayal of her former colleagues because she had trained them, trusted them, failed to recognize their disloyalty? Both, she admitted finally. I am the best person for this job. There's no other pilot alive with my specific experience in these aircraft at these performance levels. But I also feel responsible for the situation. These people learned classified techniques from me, gained access to programs because of my recommendations, developed capabilities that they're now using against American interests. Ma'am, that's not your fault. Counterintelligence is supposed to prevent recruitment of personnel in classified programs. Maybe, but when I taught Sarah Volkov how to handle aircraft at extreme altitudes, when I showed her techniques for recovering from situations that should be fatal, when I helped her become one of the most skilled pilots in the world, I bear some responsibility for what she's doing with those skills now. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Colonel, tomorrow's mission, it's not about redemption or settling old scores. It's about protecting current operations and demonstrating that American aviation capabilities remain superior to stolen technology. I understand. But if you encounter Volkov in the air, if this becomes a direct confrontation between you and someone you trained... what will you do? Maggie looked out the window at the lights of Edwards Air Force Base, where she had spent the most important years of her career, pushing the boundaries of human flight. Tomorrow she would return to that same sky, flying aircraft based on technology she had helped develop, potentially facing a former student who had betrayed everything they had worked for together. I'll do my job, she said simply. I'll protect American interests, demonstrate American capabilities, and ensure that stolen technology cannot be used against us with impunity, even if it means confronting Volkov directly. Maggie's voice was steady, carrying the authority of someone who had made life-and-death decisions in the sky for more than 6 decades. Patricia, I taught Sarah Volkov everything she knows about flying at extreme altitudes. But I didn't teach her everything I know. The mission briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base was packed with young pilots, their faces reflecting the same mixture of excitement and nervousness that Maggie remembered from her own early days in experimental aviation. She stood at the front of the room, wearing the blue uniform she had thought she would never put on again, speaking to aviators who had grown up in a world made safer by technologies she had helped develop decades earlier. The aircraft you'll be flying incorporates flight control systems based on research conducted in the 1970s, she was saying, gesturing to technical diagrams on the large display screen. The mathematical models for high angle of attack recovery were developed through experimental flights that pushed aircraft beyond their theoretical limits. A young captain raised her hand. Ma'am, the flight manual references something called the Chun maneuver for extreme altitude recovery. Is that named after you? Maggie smiled, still adjusting to being able to discuss her work openly after 40 years of enforced silence. The success of the classified mission 6 months earlier had led to a partial declassification of her service record, allowing her to finally claim credit for innovations that had been protecting aviators for decades. It is, she confirmed. The Chun maneuver was developed after we lost 3 aircraft in high-altitude stall conditions. The recovery technique allows pilots to regain control in situations that were previously considered fatal. Another pilot spoke up. Colonel, is it true that you broke the sound barrier in level flight before any official records show it was possible? Official records show what they're authorized to show, Maggie replied diplomatically. But yes, I was involved in early supersonic flight testing that pushed the boundaries of what was considered achievable. The questions continued for another hour, each one revealing how her classified work had influenced current aviation practices. It was gratifying and overwhelming to finally receive recognition for achievements that had been hidden for so long. But it also felt strange to discuss classified programs with young pilots who saw them as historical rather than contemporary. After the briefing, Maggie walked across the base to a small ceremony that would have been impossible just months earlier. The Air Force was dedicating a new flight test facility in her honor, the Colonel Margaret Chen Experimental Flight Research Center. The building would house advanced simulation equipment and serve as a training facility for the next generation of test pilots. General Morrison, now Chief of Staff of the Air Force, delivered the dedication remarks to an audience that included aviation leaders, defense contractors, and retired military personnel who had benefited from Maggie's innovations throughout their careers. Colonel Chun's contributions to aviation safety and capability development span more than 6 decades, Morrison said. Her work in experimental flight testing established protocols and procedures that have saved countless lives and advanced American aerospace superiority. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. As Maggie stepped forward to accept the honor, she noticed several familiar faces in the audience. Captain Rodriguez, the airline pilot whose flight she had helped navigate through turbulence, had traveled from Denver to attend the ceremony. Sarah Martinez, the young flight attendant from that same flight, was there as well, now training to become a pilot herself after being inspired by meeting someone who had dedicated her life to aviation. Admiral Patterson presented her with a framed citation that officially acknowledged her service in classified programs for the first time in public records. Dr. Williams gave her a technical report detailing how her experimental data was being used to develop the next generation of aerospace vehicles. But the most meaningful moment came when a group of female pilots approached her after the ceremony. They ranged in age from recent academy graduates to senior officers with decades of experience, but they all shared a common connection. Their careers had been made possible by barriers Maggie had broken decades earlier. Colonel Chun said, Colonel Diana Santos, an F-35 pilot with combat experience in 3 different theaters, I wanted you to know that every time I strap into a fighter aircraft, I'm following in the path you carved through the sky 50 years ago. Major Rebecca Kim, a test pilot assigned to the latest experimental programs, added, Ma'am, the opportunities I have today exist because you proved that women could handle any aircraft, any mission, any challenge that the Air Force could present. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, no relation, despite the shared surname, spoke for the younger generation. Colonel, I'm planning to apply for the astronaut program next year. If I'm selected, I'll be building on foundations you established when you were pushing aircraft to the edge of space. Maggie felt tears threatening as she looked at these accomplished aviators whose